Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard the Financial Independence Podcast.
G'day, and welcome to another episode of Captain Fi, the Financial Independence Podcast, where I open the cockpit to some of the best and brightest in personal finance, as well as those who have reached or are on their way to financial independence. Before we get started, remember, nothing said here is financial advice, and you should always do your own independent research before making any financial choices. With that being said, I hope you enjoy the episode and learn something new. This podcast is brought to you by the best portfolio tracking tool for Aussie investors. ShareSite makes it incredibly simple to track your portfolio with automatic updates of share purchases and dividends, easy-to-read graphs, and comprehensive tax and performance reporting, all wrapped up in an easy-to-use cloud-based system. For users with fewer than 10 holdings, it is completely free, and I even used the free version for years. Head over to captainfi.com/ShareSite-review to see if ShareSite is for you. Captain Fi listeners can score themselves 4 months of ShareSite Premium for free by using the bonus sign-up code in the article. If you do ever decide to hold more than 10 stocks, be sure to use this code to get your first 4 months for free. Even if you do only plan to use the free version, using the code means if you ever do upgrade, you will still get your 4 months for free. Ditch the Excel spreadsheet and complete your tax with a click of a button by signing up today. That's captainfi.com/ShareSite-review for your 4 free months. On board today is Corwin, a fellow aerospace engineer and fire blogger from Engineering Your Fire, with a bachelor's, master's, and PhD in aerospace engineering, as well as over a decade of engineering industry experience. I think he definitely fits the engineering bill, which we often see here in the fire community. Corwin and his partner live in Texas, and they actually reached financial independence recently at age 35 and 33, respectively, which he puts down to a combination of a lot of hard work and some good fortune. But it's also very clear that Corwin is a pretty intelligent bloke, and he's worked pretty bloody hard to command a high income and has sensibly invested a large portion of it over time. So, Corwin, thanks for your time, mate. Welcome on the pod. How you doing?
Good. Thanks very much for having me. This is a treat talking to someone on the other side of the world. It's pretty amazing to me that we can do that now.
Hey, my pleasure, mate. And so you're coming to us from Dallas, Texas, is that right?
No, Austin, Texas.
Austin, Texas. Yeah. I always get those two mixed up because I've actually got a mate who lives in Dallas, and I always mix it up because I always think that that's the capital because it's one of the biggest cities in Texas, right?
Yeah, it's a bigger city than Austin, but Austin is the capital. Austin's about 200 miles south, so it's not too close. It takes you a few hours to drive between, but it's not too far either.
Yeah, in Australia, we've got our capital is Canberra.
Right.
But Sydney is obviously way bigger than Canberra, and it's pretty close. So it's a similar sort of setup. But mate, before we get stuck in, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I was born in Dallas, but then when I hit 18, I headed down to Austin. I went to UT, University of Texas at Austin for my bachelor's and master's. And then I lived and worked in Washington, D.C., actually for a few years, which is quite different than living in Texas. And then I returned to Austin to get my PhD. And then when I finished that up, I got my position at UT as a researcher, and I've been doing that since. So it's been going really well. And in terms of personal life, very traditional family situation, wife and 2 kids. So yeah, pretty straightforward. I don't have many other hobbies besides personal finance, which is probably a sad state of affairs for most people, but that's pretty much all I've got time for. So.
Well, mate, it's definitely an interesting hobby, and it's certainly paid off for you guys, that's for sure. Now, look, everyone has a slightly different understanding about, I guess, financial independence and FIRE. Even the RE can mean so many different things to so many different people. So for you, what does FIRE mean for you?
Well, so it's funny. I tend not to have the RE at the end. I tend to just go by financial independence. That's why I renamed my site Engineering Your FI instead of Engineering Your FIRE. Just because I tend to like the financial independence aspect of it more. And I don't know how many people I've talked to about this over time. And the vast majority of people say something like, oh, I don't want to give up my job. I really enjoy it. And every time I have to say, it's not about giving up your job. It's not about giving up what you like to do. It's really about gaining power over your life, not being at the whim of the economy or someone else. It's just so much more satisfying to have that power over your life. That's really what it's all about in my mind. So it's not about no longer working. And I think that's in line with every single fire blogger and podcaster out there as well. So yeah, but it's still what I get most of the time when I talk to someone outside this community is, I don't want to give up all work. That doesn't make any sense. So yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, man. I've heard RE being like retire early or redirect employment or recreation enjoyment.
Oh,
There's all sorts
nice.
of funny little acronyms for it. But yeah, I definitely feel like freeing yourself up, giving yourself the choice, taking that power back. That's where I'm sitting at the moment. And semi-retirement is awesome because you can keep working part-time. You could switch to passion projects. You can start a business. It really does free you up to pretty much do anything you want. So that being said, would you be able to give us a bit of a rundown on your journey to financial independence and how you got started and what your journey was like?
Yeah, sure. So back when I was living in Washington, D.C., I was actually taken with the minimalist movement. I thought that was my thing. And I decided eventually I wanted to return for my PhD. And I thought, actually, I want to start some kind of business or startup, maybe along the lines of the minimalism movement. But I was on the bus to school one day and I was reading this Becoming Minimalist newsletter. And he had this link to this Mr. Money Mustache post about what would happen if everyone became super frugal. And I thought, that is an excellent question. I've often wondered that myself. So I read that post, and of course, like nearly everyone, I loved it and proceeded to read the rest of his entire site. But I feel like most people encounter him via one of the real popular posts, like the Shockingly Simple Math post or something like that. But yeah, so I basically realized FI is really my cup of tea. That's really what I want most, more than starting a successful business or anything like that. And we had just given birth to my son. And so my wife and I were like, maybe we should just take this reasonably good paying job that you can get with this PhD that you just spent all these years getting and really go after FI instead. So that's what we ended up deciding to do. And I still very much enjoyed the job and the people I worked with. It was a great place. So I think it was a very good decision. And then basically a very high savings rate, low cost index fund investing, really strong bull market, fortunately as well, from 2016 to 2020. So we were at leanish FI, somewhere between lean FI and standard FI by 2020. And then, of course, we know what happened spring of 2020. But the markets also returned really rapidly. So we hit standard FI not too long after that. And now we're on track to get to our fat FI goals, which are always changing on us, of course. So that's probably it in a nutshell.
Oh, we got to be careful with shifting goalposts there, mate.
I know, man. I know. It's dangerous. It's dangerous. I also like having a goal, though, so I don't know.
Yeah, dude, it's pretty awesome that you're able to achieve your goal, though. I mean, obviously, staging through lean fire to fire. So, what exactly are your fat fire goals?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I tend not to talk about absolute numbers, but we have a series of things like, okay, what if we want this withdrawal rate percentage, right? We want to get down to 3% withdrawal rate. And what if we go after this crazy high spending threshold, which would let us live somewhere else outside of the extremely hot Texas summer every year? Let's go to live down in Australia every summer, right? Which would be y'all's winter. And we say, okay, how much does that cost? All right, then you tend to pick our withdrawal rates based on the CAPE ratio. So, okay, given market status right now, so we tend to extrapolate along those lines and we come up with these goals. And then we're like, okay, once we get to those goals, now let's go to the next one. So, yeah.
Yeah, I get it, mate. So, look, I'm not like your super smart investor guy. Like, I'm good at saving money and investing it to index funds.
Yep.
So when you talk about like CAPE, like what is the CAPE ratio?
Yeah, that's a good question. So CAPE is the 10-year average of the price to earnings ratio of the total U.S. stock market. Actually, I think it's typically associated with the S&P 500. So this is a very U.S.-focused metric, but I think it can be applied to other markets, of course. And basically that tells you what a reasonable withdrawal rate is based on the current valuation of the market. So,
right, so it can actually change.
Right. So the nice thing about that, though, is that if the markets drop heavily, that means the safe withdrawal rate also changes accordingly, right? So you're not just screwed if the markets drop. And if the markets rise, then that safe withdrawal rate changes accordingly as well. So there's a great website called Early Retirement Now that's run by a guy named Karsten, who has done a ton of analysis. He has what's called a safe withdrawal series. It's very long and very technical, and I love it, as do a lot of other people in the community. I highly recommend checking that out. I have a PhD in aerospace engineering, but he has a PhD in economics, so he definitely has a big leg forward on me on that front.
Yeah, Carsten is bloody brilliant. Actually, he came on the show a couple of weeks ago.
Oh,
And
okay.
yeah, look, I discovered his site and I was like, whoa, this has gone way over my head. And look, I don't have a PhD, but I do have a master's degree in aerospace engineering. And I thought that I was pretty good at math. I thought I was pretty good at personal finance, but that stuff, whoa, straight over my head. And the thing that really confused me was, I guess when we talk about this Kate ratio, I always thought that if the market drops, then you should tighten your belt a bit. Whereas, like, some of the stuff that Carson is talking about and what you just mentioned now is that you could actually increase your withdrawal rate when a market drops. And that concept just blew my mind.
Yeah. But see, the thing is, your assets are probably going to drop too, right? If you're invested. So your withdrawal rate can increase, but your assets also probably dropped. So if you compare your expenses to your assets, so it's a mixed bag, right? So yeah, I think one of Carson's recent posts, he talked about how the markets have dropped quite a bit. However, to the point that a 4% withdrawal rate, the 4% rule was good again, right? But odds are your assets had also dropped if you were using standard index funds, right? So it's funny how that ratio changes, but your assets change, the markets change. So you have to look at it all as a whole. But yeah, I think still in general, it is a good idea to tighten your belt a bit when the markets are down. So yeah, that's my overall take.
Yeah, because I guess just for me, if I'm trying to plan it out logically without resorting to like modeling or formulas or anything, if the market drops and you're in the accumulation phase,
That's
like
great.
everyone knows it makes sense to buy more, right? And
Yep,
then
definitely.
if the market's like really high and you sell, well, like you've made a profit, right? So that's the whole buy low, sell high thing.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully you want to accomplish that via an annual rebalancing, right? So if you've got
Yeah.
some stocks and bonds, then you're selling high and buying low automatically doing that.
Yeah, see, now that's something that I'm yet to do is branch out and play bonds because at the moment I'm only recently retired and I've pretty much been camp growth, and so I've had almost 100% growth assets, probably like 95% growth assets and about 5% cash. Equivalents have been offset a couple of years worth of cash on my mortgage. And so I think I'd read about the efficient frontier and how J.L. Collins explained it to me, how he keeps, I think, 20% bonds through a bond index
Yeah.
fund.
And some people would say that's pretty aggressive for someone his age. They would say, whoa, he should be down to 30 or 40% bonds and corresponding amount of equities. So yeah, to each his own too.
Yeah, and so I get the principle of having the bonds and stocks and the rebalancing to buy low, sell high. But what I don't understand is if the market does drop and you say you are invested and the market drops, wouldn't it be better to, if you can, to tighten your belt a little bit? So there's this new, I guess it's not a new concept. I mean, it's always been there, but it's, I guess, being talked about a little bit more, called flex rate. And what essentially flex rate is if the market drops and your assets come down and you're maintaining a fixed withdrawal rate, okay, so your income's going to drop, but you can tighten your belt. So maybe instead of getting the Scotch fillet, maybe you just get the chuck.
I have no idea what those things are.
Oh, sorry. So in Australia, it's like, hey, come on, you're Texan. You should be all over the barbecue stuff.
Different names, I guess, for it.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So yeah, just like a really expensive steak. It might be like $50 a kilo for Scotch, or it might be like $10 a kilo for chuck or something. I mean, I don't eat a lot of meat personally, but it just means tightening your belt. Maybe you stop spending as much. Maybe you don't go out as much. Maybe you actually pick up a part-time job.
Yeah.
And
So there's actually a lot of discussion in the FI community about that. A lot of people believe, especially if you retire young or you hit FI young, do the retire early thing. Since you're young, you have flexibility. So you can tighten your belt, you can reduce spending. But then there are others that argue back and say, hey, what if the markets are down for a lot longer than you think? You could be looking at a lot of belt tightening for many years. So that's a point of quite a lot of discussion still in the community is what is an acceptable amount of belt tightening and for how long are you willing to do it, right?
Yeah, it's true. And I think it's probably something you want to plan out ahead, right? Because just
Oh,
like
yeah.
with investing, you always want to have a plan so that if stuff does go to poo, or for example, if you're in the accumulation phase and you want to buy and the market all of a sudden tanks, we all know now, and it's a great opportunity to buy, but it could be quite a different feeling when it actually does happen.
Yeah.
Everyone's saying, oh, the sky's falling in. No, this is not the same crash as last time. This is definitely the end. So it can be very spooky. And I know that it's stuffed me in the past. And that's where I found auto investing became really helpful because it took the human
Oh,
out
yeah.
of the loop. And
Yep.
it just rain, hail, or shine every fortnight or month, that auto invest is going to ping off. So, as someone from previously being in engineering and then working in aviation as a pilot, automation is really the key, I think.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the automation level in modern aircraft is incredible. And that's how we achieve these incredible safety standards as well. So,
Yeah. I'm just thinking, how long do you tighten your belt for? It's a good question. And I guess ultimately, you'd just go back to work, wouldn't you? I mean, maybe it would
yeah.
be hard if you had been out of the workforce for a while, but maybe that's an argument against the quote unquote early retirement. Maybe that's an argument for semi retirement and
Yeah, exactly.
keeping your
Yeah.
toe in the water, sort of thing.
So I just put out a recent post about exactly that, how there are so many valuable aspects of dropping down to part time instead of leaving the workforce completely, whether entrepreneurial or with a standard job. If you do see a huge drop in the markets, right, and you've been working part time for a job somewhere, then you're going to be so much better prepared to either ramp up back up to full time if you need to, or even just that smaller amount of income will be incredibly valuable going forward. And it's just a better balance too. I think a lot of people, especially they retire early, they go from tons of work and no time to spend any of the money that they earn, right? to lots of time, but they're worried about their spend rate and whether that's going to put them above a healthy withdrawal rate. And in my mind, a really nice balance going down to a part-time role. And like you said, if shit hits fan, then you can really ramp up far more easily as a result.
So I want to ask a little bit more about, I guess, the withdrawal rates and saving rates. But what I want to do first is, I guess, maybe finish up a little bit more about your career, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah, so I mean, we jokingly get referred to as aerosexuals in the industry, and look, most young kids are pretty excited when they see big jet, big airliner, like military fighter jet. They're pretty sexy things, right? So for a lot of us, it's a pretty obvious career choice to move into aviation. And of course, aviation is built on engineering and a lot of hardworking, smart professionals learning from mistakes that we've made in the past. And you've really taken it to the next level, like with insane levels of postgrad education. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about your choice to move into the industry, what it was like to study, do your postgraduate work, and now life as an aeronautical engineer?
Sure. So I have never heard the word aerosexual before. That's quite a new one for me.
Well, there you go, mate. Educational
sounds
podcast.
it sounds like someone who enjoys the Mile High Club on a regular basis to me. So yeah, actually, I didn't start as an aerospace engineer. I got admitted to college, university, as a computer science student. But I was reading this paper course catalog back in the old days when they still had those, and just ran into the aerospace description. I was like, oh, this is what I want. I was a big Star Trek fan, and I thought I might want to do some engineering, but none of the other kinds of engineering really jumped out at me. So yeah, and I had to knock on some doors to get into that aerospace department because I'm coming from the computer science department. But it's funny, I think you've got this aviation background and aeronautical engineering background, and I'm on the other side of the fence within the aerospace community. So I am what I would call an astronautical engineer. So it's really more focused on spacecraft and spacecraft navigation versus aircraft and aviation. So I was actually very lucky. I got a NASA fellowship for my PhD, and I was able to, with that NASA fellowship, study spacecraft navigation around small bodies like asteroids and comets using something called optical navigation. So it was a really, very good experience. And yeah, I've done a variety of things since then. I would say, though, I tend to tell people I got my PhD in aerospace engineering, but really what I got my PhD in was statistical estimation, which I know is probably going to instantly put most people to sleep when they hear those words. But it's such a valuable skill that you can apply to a wide range of industries. So yeah, in general, my experience as an aerospace engineer.
That's awesome, man. So you worked for NASA?
So when I was in DC, I worked for a NASA contractor, but I worked so much with NASA people that sometimes I was basically part of the NASA community. And
Mate,
then,
that's really cool.
yeah, and I got this NASA fellowship. So I guess maybe you could say I was working for NASA, but really my boss was ultimately my PhD advisor at the university. So that was a interesting funding situation, but really nice for me as a student as well, because I could really focus on the research. And I strongly encourage anyone going after an engineering graduate degree in the US or elsewhere to try to go after some of these really awesome fellowships that can help you get your degree a lot faster and more effectively.
Mate, I think we're going to have to chat offline about this because hearing you talk, I did my master's in space engineering and I definitely wasn't at the level that you did, but I worked on optical flow as a navigational tool as well. So using small sensors and mostly on like drones.
Okay.
Yeah, with the idea of being able to use it on spacecraft. So yeah, that's actually super exciting. It's not something I've really talked too much about on the pod or my blog because it's, I don't know, it's, I guess, pretty niche. But one thing that I have always thought about doing is, coming back and studying a PhD.
Yeah, definitely. You won't have to worry about funding as much, I guess, since you're financially independent, which would be nice. So you'll probably be able to get there a little bit more easily if you can self-fund yourself.
Yeah, but I mean, we've got a small space industry here in Australia, but it really focuses more on commercial management of contracts, I guess. Well, you say airspace management, maybe that would be orbital management and frequency allocation. There's not as much as a indigenous, I guess, space industry like in the US, where they obviously have the space race and now they're like sending manned missions to the moon soon. Oh my God, that's incredible, right?
Yeah. Well, maybe you'll have to come to the States for a few years and get your PhD. How about that?
Oh, that'd be the dream. But gosh, the cynic inside of me just always says, oh, this research is really just about designing weapons at the end of the day. But I'm sure there's some pretty awesome innovations that have come out of the space race. Can we get like Teflon and Tupperware and stuff out of the space race?
Well, a lot of people would argue modern computing came from the space race, the miniaturizing computers. So yeah, it's even things that are no one's ever heard of that are vital to so many things we do today. Things like the Kalman filter. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of that, but it's a computational technique that allows you to take noisy measurements from sensors and estimate your state, your position and velocity and things like that. So yeah, it's pretty amazing what the Apollo program alone gave us.
Sorry, I'm just getting like PTSD flashbacks when you bring up Kalman filters because it was a huge part of the space engineering and a lot of the professors and stuff were just like, oh yeah, you guys know this from your bachelors and we'll just get you to build them and use them to process these signals and stuff. And I'm like, actually, no, this is the first time I'm hearing about it. So yeah, definitely had a few head scratching moments trying to do assignments and stuff and lab work. So yeah, man, it's such an interesting industry, isn't it? And I wonder, what are your thoughts on computing, Web3, people talking about quantum computing? It'd be exciting to see what comes next, eh?
Yeah, that's all over my head. I don't know how quantum computers work at all. I feel like very few people do. When you start reading about them, you're like, what? This doesn't make any sense. Things can mean the same state at the same time, two different states at the same time. What? So, I'm a computational engineer.
The limit of my knowledge is apparently uses a lot of liquid helium, and that's really cold.
Yep. Right.
So look, I guess getting back on topic, why do you think there's so many engineers in the fire community?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's actually a 2013 post by Mr. Money Mustache where he did this survey. And I think it might be still live too. And apparently 1 in 6 of his readers were engineers versus 1 in 200 of the US population. So very highly concentrated. There's a lot of theories about that. My favorite theory is that a lot of engineers are trained to step back from a problem and say, okay, what is the ultimate goal here? What is the ultimate, what we would call performance index we're trying to optimize, right? And so when you think about that and you think about your spending in life, you're like, oh, wait a minute. My ultimate goal is not to become the richest person in the world or to buy all the things, right? Ultimately, I want to be happy and fulfilled life. And when you read about a lot of the writings and the podcasts in the fire community, okay, these people really seem to have a better bead on the best performance index for life. So I think engineers are wired that way to see that by training or by intuition. And then I think another big thing is engineers are not afraid to do the math most of the time. They're not afraid to whip out their spreadsheets and look at mathematical tools to see, okay, if I save at this rate, I can see how I can be financially independent in X years, right? That makes sense. It's logical. So I think for those reasons, engineers are a really good fit for FI. But I think also over time, I've seen the community broaden quite a bit. I think it was a lot of engineers and finance gurus in the beginning, but I feel like it's broadening some. I feel it's slowed down a little bit in the last few years, which is disappointing. But I think it's just getting into the part of the community and the part of the population that it's going to take a bit more time to get these principles through. But we're talking about doing the math. That's actually a thing that I talk about a lot on my site. And then I try to emphasize there's a lot of tools out there. And a lot of people get overwhelmed by the tools and they don't understand the tools, or they think, well, this tool doesn't really quite do what I want it to do. And they spend hours and days and weeks fiddling around with these tools trying to get it to do what they want. But I feel like it's actually really good to try to do it on your own as much as you can. Break out the spreadsheets and try to do the math yourself. At least try, right? Because there's so many valuable skills you can gain from that. You're going to trust the answer more, at least I do. And you can check your answers against other people's tools. But I think that's something that is not emphasized a lot in the fire community, which I like to emphasize, which is try to do the math yourself. Really get in there and see if you can figure out the answer. And you can check it always and make sure it's logical. But don't just rely on other tools you find online.
Yeah, a big one is especially when it comes to fees as well, because like a 1% fee doesn't sound like much, but that's actually 10% of your investment returns.
Yeah,
and when you look at the way that compounds over time, you end up with 2/3 of what you could have over. I think if you look on Passive Investing Australia, awesome blog, and he's gone through and actually, I think it's over a 30-year period, looked at the impact of a 1% fee on a predominantly index-based portfolio. And yeah, it's 1/3 of your nest egg. And then the crazy thing is once you switch from like accumulation to retirement, you start looking at cash flows in retirement. Well, if you're paying a 1% fee, your 4% rule becomes a 3% rule. Not because you're having a more conservative drawdown, literally because you're paying 1% in fees. And so between losing 1/3 of your nest egg and 25% of your cash flow, you end up with half of the income in retirement that you could have. And that's pretty scary, to be honest.
Oh, yeah.
This is out there that a 1% fee is acceptable, but it can result in half the retirement income. That is just madness. That is madness.
Humans still really have a hard time understanding compounding. Most people have a really hard time understanding it. It's just not intuitive to us. We're used to linear motion, linear things. 1%, that's not too bad. But compounding over time, it's brutal. It's absolutely brutal. Yeah. I think also a lot of people don't understand the difference between things that are random or stochastic versus deterministic, which is certain. So the markets can go up and down, right? Over time, long term, they're going to pull ahead. Most people will agree that's likely going to happen. But a fee is guaranteed. It's a guaranteed loss, right? And so it's just that's something that you can minimize. It's like taxes in that sense, right? Taxes are deterministic. They are something that if you can lower, you can lower them. Whereas returns, they're variable, right? You don't know from year to year what it's going to do. So I strongly encourage people to go after fees and to find ways to reduce their tax burden via retirement accounts, because that's really what you can control.
Spoken like a true statistician there, mate. Hey, maybe one day you can actually explain to me the difference between mode, median, and middle, and I'll actually remember it. Hey, so I'm mindful you've only got a short amount of time before you've got to put your kids to sleep. Now, this is something you talk about online on your blog, Engineering Your Fire, is one of the reasons you were interested in fire in the first place is you wanted to have time to raise your kids and you wanted to raise financially savvy kids. What do you think this means practically from a parenting standpoint, and how are you planning to teach your kids about money?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I am of the opinion that actions speak a lot louder than words when it comes to kids. So I think just doing it yourself, being FI or getting to FI, being on that path, kids are smart. They can pick up on that a lot more easily than I think most people recognize. The benefits, of course, we all have probably heard these many times before. You're typically going to be a lot less stressed about money. You're going to have fewer fights about money with your spouse or partner. You're going to have a lot more time with your kids. They're going to see that. They're going to see how much less stressed and how much more time you have with them. So I feel like that's the most important thing. Now, in terms of like directly educating them about it, I tend to think there's a bimodal distribution here. So for younger kids, you don't really want to go beyond the standard money basics, the importance of saving. You really don't even want to get into compound interest and all that kind of stuff real rigorously. Once they reach like middle school, high school, 11, 12 years of age and older, maybe earlier than that, then you can start explaining the more advanced concepts. So that tends to be I've read a few books about money for kids. They're almost invariably written for the standard audience that's not on their way to financial independence. But that is, our goal is essentially to demonstrate via action instead of trying to just shove it all down their throats as early as we can. And if so, for example, this summer, I'm half-time, my wife is half-time, and as a result, we can trade off and spend time with our son who's out of school this summer, and we can go out and see sights around the city and enjoy having this time off from school, enjoy time with him. If we were both working full-time, that absolutely would not be happening, right? We would barely be getting the stuff we need to get done on the weekends and stressed out, and it would be much less enjoyable. So, yeah, I'm going to caveat all of that with teaching kids about FI is definitely not my strong background. I don't tend to focus that as much on that on my site, but maybe when my kids are a little older, I'm going to start learning more and writing more about that.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, it's pretty much like how J.L. Collins' Simple Path to Wealth, his blog and his book, that's how it came to be. Yeah. He was explaining to me how basically it started as writing letters to his daughter to improve her finances. And then Mr. Money Moustache, wow, he talks about all of the opportunities that he has to be a kick-ass parent because their whole project was raising their son. I think those two sites had a big influence on me and my goals. I actually just finished reading The Barefoot Investor for Kids. So if you don't know who The Barefoot Investor is, he's basically the Australian version of Dave Ramsey. Bit of a guru. Maybe just take away the evangelism. And
I think I've heard the name before. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. No, he's a really good dude. Yeah, his book's probably like the most popular book. Barefoot Investor is like probably one of the biggest ones in Australia. I mean, geez, it's really helped me. I read that 2016. God, it was a while ago, and it certainly helped me get on the right track. So, yeah, I owe him a lot. It's full of just no nonsense, good gouge, really.
We'll get back to the show in a moment, but for now, I want to ask you a question. Do you have a side hustle? And if you do, is it scalable? My side hustle is building and running websites, a form of digital real estate. Now, it might sound tricky to make money online, but really, they're just small online businesses that have low overheads, high margins, and which you can easily scale by outsourcing. If you've ever read The 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss, then you're on the right track. What I love about websites is, just like my investments, they're working 24/7 to make me richer. And I can put as much or as little effort into running them as I like. I can pay a writer to produce a piece of evergreen content, which is then edited and posted by a virtual assistant, and then it can be viewed potentially millions of times and easily updated by my editors over the years to remain relevant. If you want to learn more about this lucrative side hustle and retraining for the digital workforce revolution, then check out my article about making money online and read my review of the eBusiness Institute and their online self-paced courses. The eBusiness Institute cover everything from total beginners right through to advanced web design and how to buy, renovate, run, and sell websites for profit. As a graduate of the eBusiness Institute, I can't thank Matt and Liz enough for the valuable web skills I've developed, and now I can enjoy growing my portfolio of websites for semi-passive income. Captain Fi listeners can register for free access to some of their resources by following the link in the eBusiness Institute review article on captainfi.com. So, what are you waiting for? Start learning how to build a portfolio of digital real estate and use websites to make money today.
I guess speaking of money and teaching kids about FI, not that this is a huge part of it. Obviously, we all know that behaviour is the most important thing when it comes to financial independence and personal finance. But there obviously is a little bit that you do need to know about investments. So engineers, we do tend to maybe overdo things. I certainly did at the start. So I'm really interested to hear, how do you invest, mate? What do you invest in and why?
Yeah. So we've talked about J.L. Collins a lot on this episode, and I am almost 100% aligned with his, probably 100% actually, aligned with his investment philosophy of simplicity, index funds. I am a big fan of those. I really dislike speculative investments like gold and crypto. I always refer people to the Mr. Money Mustache post back in 2018. It's why Bitcoin is stupid. I really like that title too. But yeah, something else that J.L. Collins said many times, he's happy investing just in total U.S. stock and bond markets versus total world funds. And when I first read that, I was pretty intrigued. I was like, why was he saying that? So I dug into it a bit. And in the end, I tend to agree with him, actually. So one of the things we were talking about fees before, right? So the total Vanguard index fund here in the US has a 0.04% expense ratio. But if you want to get their total world index, it's over double that. It's 0.1%. It's not that too bad. That's 0.1%. So it's not nothing. And the thing is, we were talking about before, there's no guarantee one market's going to do better than the other. So I tend to say, well, higher expenses are guaranteed. Now, here's a little bit different, though, here in the U.S. The market capitalization in the U.S. is almost 60% of the world market capitalization. And a lot of large U.S. companies are international as well. So you get plenty of international exposure. So it's easier for me and other people in the U.S. to do domestic only versus someone like yourself in Australia. We're going to have a lot more exposure that way. However, there was a really good post that I read about a guy named Nick Maglioli. I think I got his last name right. Maybe not. It was called Why Investing Like Your Neighbors Isn't as Dumb as It Seems. And he made some really good points about the value of investing primarily in domestic markets. And it gets down to the fact that that's the community you live in, right? So if you invest heavily internationally and it goes really down and everyone around you is doing quite well because the domestic market is up, right? That is going to feel a lot worse than the opposite in general, right? So he actually has a real interesting thought. Maybe we can put that in show notes or something. It showed Australia as well. And apparently Australia has, I think, 2.4% of the capitalization, but 66% of Australians put their money in domestic equities. So I think there is something to that. So yeah, I think in terms of investments, I mean, otherwise I'm just index funds, simplicity, total stock market funds. That's pretty much it.
Yeah, nice, mate. It's good to see someone clever who experienced mathematician and engineer keeping it simple.
Yeah.
Look, that home bias thing, yeah, it's massive here in Australia. I think there's some like tax advantages and like the franking credit scheme and the franking credit refund scheme can be quite a good source of income for retirees here in Australia. So, you know how like corporations pay tax, they pay I think it's 30% tax rate for large businesses in Australia.
Okay.
So when you get like a dividend from a company, Australian companies typically pay like much higher dividends than in the US. So they typically pay around like 4%. Wow. Maybe even 3 to 5% in dividends, depending on the company, because it's dominated by like industrials, like miners, banks, and even telecommunications. So they're like quite mature businesses, and they're not really like innovating. They're more at the stage where they're like, cool, well, we've got a solid business practice, we know what we're doing, we've got this cash flow, so we're going to start returning the wealth, distributing the wealth to the shareholders.
You're not going to see so much growth, but that's a really solid dividend too.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And I know in terms of total return, dividend versus capital growth doesn't actually matter. And ironically, I find myself siding towards the side of capital growth because then you can decide when you are going to sell a parcel and crystallize the sale. And it just makes it a bit easier from like a tax planning perspective as well. Whereas, with a dividend, it's no, we are selling this portion of value, we're giving it back to you, and then you've got to pay tax on it, which can be a bit rough. I'm not sure what the rules are in the US with dividend taxation. So essentially, because the company, before it can distribute a profit, has to pay corporate taxes, they get distributed with what's called a franking credit. And God knows why it's called that. It's probably named after like an economist. Old Frank, who set up the tax. So old Frank gives you a tax credit for the corporate tax that was paid, which is 30%. And to be on a 30% taxation level, you need actually quite a healthy bit of income here in Australia. It's like a tiered system. So, you don't pay tax on like the first 20 grand or slightly under 18 grand. And then you pay progressively more tax as you earn more. And so most people won't be on like an absolute 30% tax bracket.
Yeah.
And so they'll typically get a refund. So some of their tax will get paid by this. And actually, if you're on a fairly low income, because you might be retired, like if you're only on a $40,000 income, because that's all that you need in fire, because your house is paid off and you're not having an extravagant lifestyle, you can actually get a refund. And it was a very political topic recently. I think it was the Labor Party who tried to do away with the franking credit refund scheme and pretty much lost them the losable election. So I think, it just goes to show how deeply ingrained people, particularly retirees, the older generations, really want their franking credits.
That's interesting when you say Franken. So have you heard of Frankenstein?
Yeah.
Yeah. So typically, at least in the US, when someone says Franken something, they mean something that's been dead and been brought back to life, but it's not good.
Franken. Sorry, I'm trying to say franking, like Frank ING. It's probably just my accent.
Gotcha.
Yeah, but it seems that like in Australia, we definitely have a big home bias. And I definitely started with that. I started out buying predominantly Australian index funds, and I bought the fund with the lower management expense ratio, which wasn't a Vanguard fund, it was actually a beta shares fund, and 200 index versus the 300 index, so pretty much the same thing. And it was good. It helped me build like a baseline level of dividend income. And after that, I really started to properly look at my splits, and actually have the majority of my investments in the US. Yeah, I've got over 50%.
Really?
Yeah, 50% of my index funds are US based. I mean, having said that, I do have an investment property in Australia, so that probably like skews it back to a domestic bias as well. And so with your investments, so you have your VTSX, which, as you've mentioned, is pretty much, even though it's a domestic fund, it does have global diversification. Right. And we talked about bonds earlier. So do you do a bond fund like JL?
Yep. Total Bond Market Index Fund, VBTLX, I think.
VBTLX to smooth the ride. I can just hear The Godfather in my head now.
Yep.
Yeah, awesome.
It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, love it, mate. Hey, keep it simple. And so we touched on this earlier in the interview, mate. So you were working towards, you hit your lean fire number. It was 2020. You recently hit your fire number, and you mentioned you're working towards fat fire. I know it can be a bit of a changing goalpost, but can you tell us a little bit about, did you have numbers? How did you plan your investments going forward?
Yeah, so we had numbers. Of course, inflation's been pretty rough lately, right? So those numbers can change quite a bit as a result. And we have numbers, but we try to base them on our current expenditures and then also future desired expenditures. So like I mentioned before, we live in a very hot place. It's getting hotter, right? And it'd be real nice to take advantage of the fact that our kids are out of school in the summertime to go elsewhere, maybe eventually one day, right? Or maybe at least for part of the summer or something like that. So if we were to do something like that, that'll cost a bit more money, right, than otherwise. So we try to tie our numbers to expense levels, conservative expense levels. And that's why I also tell other people, if they're interested in lean FI versus standard FI versus fat FI, don't just come up with random numbers. A lot of people will say, well, I want $2.5 million because I want to be able to spend $100K a year with a 4% rule, right? Well, is that tied to anything in reality of your life? So they just have this 100K a year number in their mind, right? So I'm a big proponent of tying it to actual expenses, even if you have to throw out some guesstimates. I have no idea how much it would cost to go spend a good chunk of the summer somewhere else. It would depend on where we go, right? So we just come up with a real rough number and a very conservative number, and then we work from there. But it's changing. But I will say, having a goal too, if you didn't have anything you're shooting for, there's a phrase in the FIRE community. I don't remember who it was originally attributed to because I've heard it a number of times, but the phrase is something like, the reward for financial independence is an existential crisis, right? So I think that if you hit this number and you're like, I definitely don't need more, it can be discombobulating. And so for now, we have these higher goals and it's nice to work towards something. But at some point, it really is going to be like, okay, we really don't need to shoot for anything additional. And what are we going to do from there?
Mate, I am literally recovering from my existential crisis as we speak. I was talking about this with a friend of mine. He works as an analyst in a large company and really switched on guy. And he's a bit of a sleeper when it comes to fire. He hit fire recently, but I don't think he's actually said it to anyone. He just quietly mentioned it to me one day because he knew I blogged about it, which was pretty awesome. And he goes, yeah, it's a bit unsettling, isn't it? Now that we're not motivated by money, but our whole society is built on money. So what do I do? And he jokingly said, he likes Europe and particularly the Nordic countries. And he said he's going to run away and set a bookshop up in Norway or Sweden or something, which is pretty exciting. And yeah, I was like, I don't know. I had a lot of stuff going on in my life as well. Dealt with a lot of loss recently. So definitely, I guess, getting over the grief, and also part of that as well, I guess, grieving my job in addition to family members.
Yeah, it's a big part of your identity.
Yeah, a huge part of your identity, man. And even with this whole fire thing, like I've really enjoyed blogging and podcasting about fire. And when you reach financial independence and money is no longer a thing and you're no longer on the journey, it's the end of the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
Oh, yeah.
What do I do now? And yeah,
sail off to the west, I guess.
Yeah, he recommended this book, Nausea by Sartre, and it was the hardest book I've ever read. Like, it's just not fun to read, but I'm glad that I did. And yeah, I don't want to like spoil it for anyone, but all I'd say is it's actually super relevant to the fire community. And I also did some psychedelics, which has definitely helped with my existential crisis. Not that I'm recommending anyone go out do some trips, but it's certainly interesting. And not being restricted by aviation medicals allows you to probably do that.
Well, I think that psychedelics are potentially going to make a comeback in the U.S. because they're helping so many veterans here. The studies they've done, I think that's going to bring a lot more people on board that were not on board before. So,
yeah, it's like a renaissance in the research.
Yeah, the PTSD research with psychedelics is incredible. If you have not heard about that, it's pretty amazing what they're discovering with that.
Oh, yeah. If anyone is interested, I'll put some show notes to some interesting books. But How to Change Your Mind by Michael
I read
Pollan.
that one.
Yeah. There's even the Netflix series, which is pretty good. I mean, that book's been turned into a Netflix series. There's heaps. In fact, my bookshelf is like full of them. So I got really interested and I did want to do a lot of reading before I actually tried something. We can go down a rabbit hole here, but look, I'll try and pull it back on track. All right. So back to your journey to fire, target savings rate. Did you guys have a planned or a goal savings rate that you worked towards?
Yeah. So initially it was 50% because you read that number so many places, right? And we got that pretty easily once I started full-time work. My wife was working full-time. And we worked for full-time for about 5 years. And I would say on average, we hit around 70% during that time. So we were pretty proud of that. What's really amazing, though, to me is we both dropped down to half-time at this point, but we're still at about a 60% savings rate, which is really crazy to me. So if you do the math and you just drop your income by half, right, you should drop to a 40% savings rate and from a 70%, right? But there's two reasons that we're way up at 60%. One is taxes. So here in the U.S., we have a very similar tax policy structure to what you were describing earlier, progressive taxes. And it's amazing how much more tax efficient we are at half-time income than we were at full-time income, right? Because those higher tax brackets get quite high, but we can still take advantage of retirement account contributions and things like that, which is really nice. And then, of course, also with a larger portfolio, we have more in dividends coming in and things like that, which helps boost our savings rate. But yeah, so I'm still amazed we can do that here now that we're working half-time as well. But that's, I think, the savings rate that in general we've had. And in general, I think anything above 50% is still a really amazing thing that people can shoot for and get to FI in 10 to 20 years, probably closer to 10 years if you can do that.
Yeah, that's incredible. I know JL says you should be aiming to save like at least half of your income. And that's pretty powerful. Lacey Philippich as well, she mentioned that had been her goal. And what's that? That's 17 years about?
Yeah, it
What about
depends on
that?
the interest
15?
rate you use, the
Yeah,
ROI. It heavily
yeah.
depends on that. So I did a post about that, and I used 7% real rate of return. You have to use real, so after inflation numbers.
Yeah.
But I think it's closer to 10 years. I have to go back and look at my numbers, or maybe it's 15. But it's definitely a lot less than 40 to 60,
Oh,
which is what you're going to get.
absolutely. Yeah,
So.
yeah. And then when you're up around like a 70% savings rate, like that's under 10 years. That's incredible. That's
Yeah.
like
Well,
8
what's
or
interesting
something.
is it's a logarithmic curve, right? So you don't save that many years going from 60 to 70%, actually. You save way more years going from 30 to 40% or 40 to 50%. So because of that compounding, right?
Yeah, and that is incredible. And that's really great news for people that are thinking like, oh, geez, how can I start investing? How can I start saving? Well, yeah, as we've just said, because it's a logarithmic relationship, those initial gains have massive results. And if you can go from a 5 to a 10% savings rate or a
Oh,
10
yeah.
to a 20% savings rate, you're literally shaving years and years off
Decades.
your
Yeah.
decades off your required working career. Yeah, awesome, man. I guess the next thing that comes with planning retirement and FIRE is the withdrawal rate. And the most widely known one is the 4% rule, coming out of some early statistical analysis, the Trinity study. But there is debate about this in the industry. There's new updated models come out, Monte Carlo sims. I know, this concept of flex rate tends to increase it, but other people that are quite conservative want to tend to decrease it. And I think you mentioned earlier you had planned on a 3% safe withdrawal rate. Would you be able to explain, I guess, your take on safe withdrawal rates and why you're going with that figure?
So I wouldn't say 3%. That's the worst case scenario. My safe withdrawal rate changes literally every day. So I base it on that CAPE ratio we talked about earlier, right? So it depends on the ratio of the price of in the markets to their earnings. So there's been a lot of articles out there that talk about, well, just take 1 over that ratio and then you get your rate, you get your safe withdrawal rate. So, if the Shiller PE ratio is 30, then you divide 1 divided by 30, multiply that by 100 to get a percentage, and you get that. So for yesterday, that was about 3.3%, right? And then there's been a lot of analysis by people like Karsten at Early Retirement Now that say, well, that's not quite the relationship you want to look at based on the data that we see in the historical returns. So he recommended something like 0.5 divided by K plus 1.75. So you can imagine, instead of just this inverted straight line from the origin of your plot, right, you've got a y-axis offset, and then you've got a lower slope, right? So with that, it's 3.4%, right? And then he's also done a lot of work regarding trying to update what relevant rule there is, because valuations are so much higher than they've historically been. And a part of that is that companies are more and more plowing their earnings back into their own investments, back into their own stock, right, versus paying out dividends. So that can change valuations, right, even though mathematically it's equivalent. So he's done a lot of work along there, and he's come up with his own ratio, right, that is even higher. So that right now, as of yesterday, is 3.79%. So you can see there's this wide range of withdrawal rates. And I calculate these in a spreadsheet every day because I'm me. But it ranges from 3.3 to 3.8. So it's like, well, what do you want to go with? Do you want to go with something more conservative, less conservative? So I tend to compare to the more conservative numbers, but it makes me feel better knowing that with his ratio, I've actually probably even more safe than I would normally be. So I think it's really nice to go with that data-based approach. It makes sense. If the markets are way down and you've got a particular withdrawal rate, you're going to be a lot safer than if they're way up, right? And you see that safe withdrawal rate. So it's that same withdrawal rate. So yeah, I'm a big proponent of using that. The challenge, of course, is communicating all of what I just said to someone not interested in this in 10 seconds or less.
Yeah, no, it is interesting, mate. And I think I got to do some more reading about this. I'm going to have to go back onto Early Retirement Now. And have you written any articles about the safe withdrawal rate?
Yes, but far more limited, far more crude. That's not really been the focus of my analysis. My analysis has been more on the lines of how to minimize taxes. Because again, that gets back to the whole, that's what you can guarantee. And a big concern I had when we were approaching FI is, hey, wait a minute, I've set my withdrawal rate based on this, but what about taxes? Aren't we going to be paying a good amount of taxes? Isn't that going to change our withdrawal rate? And I was really nervous about that. So I built this big model in Python and in the end, I was very relieved to find that with low expenses, fire retirees who really earn no other money actually are quite safe. They can do a lot of things that can quite minimize their earnings. And here in the US, we have something called FICA taxes, which is our Medicare and Social Security programs. Your Australian users are probably not used to, but basically that's only on earned income. So you don't have to worry about those anymore, right? If all your income is just from your investments. So I was very relieved to find that, and that's been the big focus of mine. So as a result, I have not focused on withdrawal rates as well. Plus, Karsten has this incredible series that I think probably answers most questions that most people might have. So
definitely, man. We'll obviously link to Carsten's in the show notes so people can go out and have a read. But I would say it is complicated, and if it's overwhelming you, don't stress. Literally can, as a first pass, like rough back of the envelope maths, like 4% is a pretty good number.
Absolutely.
If you want to be conservative, like 3.5%, 3%. There's so many different factors. I think it just comes down to your personal preference. And like we talked about earlier, if you have an ability to work part-time or you have a job that you can go back to, it's not worth super stressing about, but it can become quite an interesting academic exercise.
Yeah.
Now, look, I'm mindful of the clock here. So I'm going to try and squeeze as much juice out of you while I still have you, mate. Okay. So maybe we'll just go rapid fire here. Housing. So are you team pay off the mortgage, team keep the mortgage, or team rent vestor?
We are team keep the mortgage.
Yeah.
I've read a lot of arguments about actually mathematically it makes more sense to pay off your mortgage than put any of your money into bonds because those have not given anywhere close to even like a 3% mortgage, which is what we have. But I still like the liquidity of bonds. I like with rebalancing. I also like that it's like another safety margin, right? In 27 years, our mortgages are going to disappear. I'll account for that, really, although you could. And I like the fact that with inflation, the real dollar amounts will drop over time. I don't think that's a big factor. But yeah, we're keeping the mortgage over here.
Yeah, nice. It's definitely like, though, with interest rates going up, it's certainly something that people are thinking about. And I think a big thing that comes up here in Australia is we've got 6% interest rates. When you consider tax and you gross that return up, you mentioned deterministic versus stochastic. Could you invest in stocks with a theoretical long-term rate of return of 10%, or do you get a guaranteed 6% pre-tax, or when you gross it up, maybe that's 7 or 8% depending on your income? By paying off your mortgage. So yeah, definitely something for people to consider, but awesome to hear your thoughts on this. Now, you just mentioned bonds. I forgot to ask, I should have said, what's your asset allocation with bonds compared to equities?
Yeah, we're still pretty aggressive because we're still working right now. So we tend to hover around 80 to 90% ish in terms of equities. So bonds are the other percentage of that. And I don't include any of our house equity in there as well, because we don't plan to leave this house anytime soon. Or I guess we could do what's the process called? Extract that equity and invest it essentially. But that's taking on more risk as well, right? But yeah, we tend to go around 80, 90% now. If we both agreed, okay, we're really going to stop earning all money, then we'd probably reduce that maybe down to 70%.
Nice. I guess that leads well into the next one, which was when you do choose to, quote unquote, early retire. And I know early retirement, that's the dirty word, but we're just basically using that for drop down from full-time income. I mean, what would that look like for you at all?
Well, we've done that basically now. Neither of us work full-time now. And it's funny, in the future, I might go back to full-time if I decide that's something I want to do, if I'm really enjoying my job, and I do enjoy my job now. But it's nice to have that time with family and all that. But yeah, it's funny. I have a hard time answering this question. I would not be happy not working on something. I know that about myself. So I don't think I could do a traditional early retirement in the sense of not doing anything productive. Maybe I could do something like a nonprofit where I'm still working on something, building something, doing something good for the world, and I really am earning no money from it. But it would still be something. I don't think I could do the traditional early retirement physically. I don't think I physically can do it.
Yeah, it's a human thing, right? Like we need to be doing something productive or working towards something. I took some time off and played video games, playing like Fortnite. I played that for, I don't know, a couple of months full on and didn't really do much else. I did some reading and it was boring. You're going to get sick of it. Whereas I love writing, podcasting, building these websites, gardening, volunteering, getting out with the dog, training. We need something to do. And I think hard work is a reward in itself just by virtue of the fact that it's difficult. it's a challenge. We need to be challenged. And it sounds like you're a very intelligent person and you really do need that stimulation you wouldn't really get if you were just playing golf or something.
Yeah, especially after all the pain I went through to get my PhD, the idea of not using it is just, it's just tremendous waste. Like I've spent so many hours and years of my life, and I was in college for 10 years. 10 years. So, or university, as y'all probably call it.
I feel the same with my aviation career, mate. Definitely don't want to hang up the logbook and the wings just yet. Definitely still want to get some value out of it, and it is a lot of fun. So look, 10 years at university, mate. So obviously you're a very well-learned bloke. And one of the things I love to ask on these interviews is I want to find out, what are people reading? What are they listening to? Where are they getting their information from? Because that can be a great way for people on the path to fire to start emulating them and start learning, well, what are they learning? What circles are they moving in? So with that being said, mate, do you have any favourite books? They don't necessarily have to be on personal finance, but basically anything that's had a profound impact on your life.
Yeah, I have a hard time narrowing that down. Very hard time narrowing that down. So we've already talked about The Simple Path to Wealth by J.L. Collins. That is, I think, one of the best investment books ever written because it is so approachable. But outside of that, we've got two young kids at home, and one of the books that really changed our life completely was How to Talk So Kids Will Listen and Listen So Kids Will Talk. It's a classic book. It is amazing, the tools that you can pull from that book and use when you're raising kids that are incredibly effective. And then speaking of being effective, this is a book that Mr. Wayne Mustache has referenced several times, but there's a classic called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. And that, if you can internalize the lessons in that book, they are incredibly powerful as well. There's one kind of random book that I tell people sometimes about. It's called Back Sense by an author named Siegel. And I was having these back pains when we lived in Washington, D.C., and I just couldn't seem to get rid of them. And then my wife randomly finds this book in a box of giveaways at the local library. She brings it home and she says, I know your back has been having issues, so I thought I might give this to you. And I was like, oh, okay, this is random. And I read it, and it changed my life, man. It was unbelievable how much value I got out of that book in terms of alleviating back pain and regaining my life to some extent.
Okay, I'm going to find that book and buy it straight away because that's something that I've struggled with, mate, is back pain.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people in the industry have that, and maybe just a lot of people in general. We tend to be sitting in front of a screen long these days. So what about podcasts, mate? Do you listen to podcasts, or are you an audiobook podcast guy, or do you prefer just to read?
So, yeah, with 2 young kids, I don't have a lot of time to sit down and read a book in comfort without children climbing on me. So audiobooks and podcasts are definitely how I get probably the majority of my reading done now. I'd say maybe 80% of it done. I used to be a lot more focused on podcasts. So I listened to a lot of the Phi Focus podcast, Mad Fientist, of course. He was one of the early pioneers, and then Choose a Phi as well. There's some good other ones as well, the Phi Show, and then my favorite recent one is Mile High Phi. I met those guys at a recent conference, and they're real good guys. But overall, though, I feel like over time I've gravitated more towards audiobooks and less towards podcasts, just because audiobooks tend to have a lot of polish to them, right? People spend a lot of time and effort putting into them. So I like that, but also still listen to podcasts too. So that's the way you get the vibe for what's going on in the community and what's going on currently.
Definitely. And the Mile High Phi Show, that's different to the Mile High Club that you mentioned earlier.
Yes, I'm sure they aren't sad about the similarity.
Cool, man. Hey, look, it's been a blast interviewing you, mate. And I like to ask this as the last question, which some people, it can be a bit of a tricky one. But, mate, if you could distill all of your knowledge and information about personal finance down into your top 3 pieces of advice, what would they be?
There's a couple that everyone gives, which is track your expenses. And so for that one, I think you'll like this. I like to use an aerospace analogy, right? So if you're trying to navigate a plane or a spacecraft, right, you have to know where you are first in order to get to where you want to go, right? So if you don't know how much you're spending, then you're lost. You have no idea, how much you're going to need to achieve financial independence. You're not going to know how to start reducing that number. It's the foundation for everything. But everyone in the FI community spouts that endlessly. So I'm not saying anything new there, most likely. But it's funny, so few people outside the FI community really do that still, which is hopefully something we can change. And then the second big thing is just remembering the journey to FI is a marathon versus a sprint. And remember to keep enjoying your life and don't go 100%. Don't go after a 99% savings rate or something ridiculous like that. You got to keep enjoying it because it's going to take you a few years unless you have this insanely high income. And it's also really about mindset, right? It's all about keeping a good mindset about why you're doing this and the value of going after financial independence and why that's more important than buying some other thing that you know is not going to really make you all that happy. But tracking your expenses and remembering that it's a journey, those are the more standard fare. Something that I think is a bit more unique to my site and my philosophy is build your own systems for tracking all of this if you possibly can. So do it DIY is a big thing in the FI community, especially Mr. Money Mustache. But I feel like it's not as emphasized when it comes to financial tools and tracking your status. And I think that's an equally valid and strong area to DIY yourself, because the skills you get from doing that are incredible. They will pay incredible dividends. If you learn how to build a spreadsheet to track your expenses, well, guess what? You're going to know how to build a spreadsheet to look at grocery expenses for several different stores and realize, okay, I know how to optimize this now. And then you can use that tool for other things. And it's a great snowball of skill that you can build into your life. And there's lots of free tools out there you can use. There's Google and Python if you want to do some really deep analysis, if you know how to code, which is what I primarily use. But all of that with a caveat that I do recommend checking your results against some of the tools that are out there. And there's a lot of free tools you can check, and you can plug in some dummy numbers if you want and just see, okay, yeah, everything is lining up pretty reasonably. So yeah, that's the three I would go with.
Awesome. I love that. I guess it's just being a bit more actively involved in your finances rather than just passively, which is ironic because our investments, we ideally want to be as passive as possible.
Exactly.
I guess from a behavioral point of view, taking an active role in improving, like working out where you are and working out how to get to where you want to go. So I think that's awesome, man. Look, it's been an awesome interview, man. Thanks so much for your time. Before we finish up, is there anything else you'd like to mention today that we might have missed?
There's lots of things we could talk about, I can tell, but I'm not going to keep going. Also, the kids have to get ready for bed, but we should definitely talk more. I think we've got a lot in common that we'd talk about.
Yeah, mate. Well, awesome episode. Love to have you back anytime, mate. Yeah, so look, if anyone wants to find out a little bit more about your blog and yourself, where can people find out more or contact you?
Mainly through my site, engineeringyourfi.com. So you can go there. And I've also got the social media accounts. I'm not as active / skilled at those as many other people in the FI community, but I do have accounts. So you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Someday I might do a podcast. Someday I might do a video on YouTube.
Yeah, man. I feel that. It can take a lot of time, and you just got to prioritize, at the moment. That's your family, mate. Hey, thanks so much for your time, Corwin. It's been an absolute pleasure, mate. Loved having you on. I look forward to catching up in the future.
Sounds good. Thanks, man.
See you, mate.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Captain FI Financial Independence Podcast. To read the transcripts or check out the show notes, head over to www.captainfi.com for all the details. If you have a question for the captain, make sure to get in touch. You might even make it on the airwaves. You can reach me online through the Captain FI contact form or get in touch through the socials. I'm active on Facebook and Instagram, as well as a number of online finance and investing forums. And finally, remember, the information presented on the show and the links provided are for general information purposes only. They should not be taken as constituting professional financial advice. You should always do your own research when making any financial decisions and make sure it's appropriate for your personal circumstance.